Hebrews 11 verse 6 says, without faith, it is impossible to please God. The St. Paul story is a story of faith. The faith of our forefathers who dared to believe that God would do amazing things through them if they stood firmly upon His word, if they held close to His promises, and if they acted boldly and courageously upon His truth. The following stories will reveal some of the challenges, some of the ups and some of the downs of that story of faith. In James 5, James comments that Elijah was a man just like us. He prayed, and for 3.5 years no rain fell, and then he prayed again and the rain returned. But he wanted to underscore that he was a man just like us. The St. Paul story is made up of many ordinary people just like all of us, but who dared to walk by faith and believe God, and God honored their courage. This then is the story of St. Paul's. The story really begins in Germany, where discouraged Lutherans were disheartened over the state's control of the church. On the 300th anniversary of the Reformation in 1817, Frederick Wilhelm III announced the forced union of Lutheran and Reformed churches. Though this union was only to be in administrative matters, the years that followed led to greater control and interference by the government, and greater disillusionment for those faithful Lutherans. When given the opportunity to come to America, where the government guaranteed that it would make no laws governing the free exercise of religion, many left fortunes and families to sail the ocean for freedom in America. Freedom, opportunity, land, and jobs they found. Earliest immigrants to this area in this newly formed state of Illinois settled along the Sangamon River near Argenta, but coal and the railroads soon made Decatur the hub of activity. By 1860, Decatur had grown to 3,839 inhabitants. Abraham Lincoln, who earlier announced his candidacy for president in Decatur, was elected President of the United States, and resettled Lutherans were looking for a place to worship and a pastor to lead them. A certain Dr. Harkey in 1860 called together about 20 Lutherans in the basement of the old Baptist church, and Lutheran believers got to know one another in this new land. They had faith that God could establish a true church here. It was early in 1864 that a young Reverend Roller came from St. Louis. He began holding services in the Second Ward School, and by virtue of his passionate preaching, the attendance grew. He returned to St. Louis to share with leaders there the plight of the Lutherans in Decatur, and was able to raise funds enough to enable this little flock to purchase a corner lot at Wood and Edward Streets. There they built a 28 by 30 foot little frame church. In this little church, St. Paul's was formally organized on June 12th in 1861. There were 8 original signers of the Constitution. Men of faith believed God, and a new church was born. This little white frame building served as their church home for the next 16 years. The years that followed, however, were tumultuous. Pastor Roller was found not to practice the morality he preached. Worship services ceased for a time. Would the faith die out? A Pastor Kripe came in 1867, served for 2 years, started a Christian school with 42 children, but left for the greener pastures of Champaign. In 1870, a Pastor Canning came with a couple of young assistants. The membership grew. A mission in Argenta was begun. But he served only 3 years, and again for 6 months until November of 1873, no worship services were held. It was in November the 16th of 1873 that Pastor George Landgraf became pastor here at St. Paul's. He was a man of great faith who served for almost 15 years. A year after his arrival in 1874, St. Paul's was officially accepted into the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Decatur had grown by now to 9,547 people. Under Pastor Landgraf's leadership, a new brick church was built, even though there was much dissatisfaction over the location. Many felt the church should be located closer to the rapidly growing northeast side of the city. Their faith was tested in a time of discord. Nevertheless, this little brick church that was built would serve as the home for St. Paul's for the next 42 years. It was the building of this new church, coupled with the rapid growth of a mission school built at the corner of Lober and Orchard Streets, that the divisive forces marshaled, and the desire for a new congregation over there became stronger. In 1890, a new pastor, Pastor Lessman, came to St. Paul's. Yet 1 year later, he led the charge to establish this new congregation. And on November 11, 1891, St. John's was officially organized, with Pastor Lessman becoming their first pastor. 2/3 of the existing St. Paul's members joined St. John's, and the school enrollment at St. Paul's fell from 227 to 40. Their faith was tested. Would the remnant believe that Christ would again build his church? It was 1892 when Pastor Wagner, a new seminary graduate, came to rebuild St. Paul's. 10 years later, a new principal, Max Scheider, was called to the school. In 1904, a new St. Paul's school was built at the corner of Jackson and Prairie Streets. God was faithful. Momentum was building. St. Paul's was growing again. In 1905, God brought a new pastor, Pastor Ted Lorman, who served well for 20 years. By 1920, Decatur had grown rapidly to 43,818 people, and St. Paul's numbered 580 souls. In 1925, God brought a new, very capable leader, Pastor Obermeyer, who served for the next 18 years. St. Paul's grew by almost 300 members during his years. Plans were made to build a new church. Property along Wood Street was purchased. In 1928, the St. Paul's Parish House was built. Services would be held temporarily in this parish house, as in 1929, the old church was torn down. Plans for the new church were presented, but God had other plans. For the next 21 years, the congregation would worship in the temporary space on the upper floor of the parish house. St. Paul's, along with all of Decatur, would struggle to survive the Great Depression. Salaries of pastors and teachers would be cut. Coal would be rationed. The faith of God's people would be tested. But without faith, it's impossible to please God. It was Easter Sunday, 1949, and the coming of Pastor Mueller a few years earlier that set the stage for a new chapter in the St. Paul story. It was the groundbreaking day for a new sanctuary at Wood and Edward Streets. This project was called A Venture of Faith. This new house of worship was to serve God's people for the next 62 years. Additions to the parish house and a gym were added in 1964. Again in 1988, major renovations were made with the addition of a fellowship center and a Christian growth center. The congregation continued to grow throughout these years, now numbering over 2,000. In 1971, after 26 years of capable leadership, Pastor Mueller asked the congregation to seek a new senior leader. He would continue to serve as the associate. This transition would require great faith. In 1971, a tall, courageous young pastor named Chris Reinke, and he was young, just 2 years out of the seminary, he answered that call, and 7 years of rapid growth and change followed. A serious calling back to basic Bible study and new worship forms were introduced. The first DCE, Director of Christian Education, Kurt Gremmel, was added to the staff. Growth continued through some of Decatur's most prosperous years. In the mid-70s, Pastor Mueller retired, and a new associate with a strange first name was added to the staff, Pastor Ray Offerman. He became an associate in 1976 and became senior pastor in 1978. He has served in that role to this day. In the years of the 80s and 90s, a wonderful team of very talented young associate pastors joined the St. Paul staff, along with more diverse staff positions. A preschool was established. A $2.8 million expansion program was undertaken to provide fellowship and Christian growth. A new pipe organ was added. In the 80s, Pastor Gary Beyer strengthened the missionary heart and the biblical foundation of St. Paul's. He had great vision for the future. In the 90s, Pastor Bill Woolsey arrived. He was an amazing innovator and a talented organizer. He helped lead the congregation into new contemporary worship service, and St. Paul's grew rapidly, even as the city began to decline. In 1999, a new Lutheran school was purchased on Mound Road, and the Wood Street classrooms became a thriving St. Paul's daycare. During the first decade of the 21st century, St. Paul's faced new challenges and challenging decisions. Would they rest upon the successes of the past or push forward in faith? The words of Hebrews 11:6 continued to speak. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. If the membership and worshiping numbers were going to continue to grow, and a larger worship space would be needed. Many solutions were studied. A Saturday evening worship service was added. An outreach service called The Rock was begun at Richland College. Finally, in July of 2009, the congregation acted in faith again and voted to purchase the Backrack property on West Mound Road. A whole new era of St. Paul's ministry of sharing the gospel of Jesus was begun with the people of Decatur and Macon County. So what will the future hold? What will be the next chapters in this St. Paul story? Only Jesus really knows, because this is and has always been His church. It rests on His promise that He is the one who builds His church. 150 years of blessings need to reassure us that the gates of hell will not prevail against this church. And that if we continue to be faithful to His word, that we trust the Holy Spirit who called together those first believers and continues to call believers together, that if we trust that Spirit and if we cling to His pure teaching and we stand together as a body of believers, believing that He can do more than we can even dare ask or imagine, if we are faithful, then He will continue to grow and reach out and claim lost people. As we grow, we remember, without faith, it's impossible to please God. This is the St. Paul story.